I mean, this is a fascinating take on Marx, and I guess let's just start off with what inspired you to write this book.
I guess so. Partly in response to this kind of right-wing talking point, which is that anything they don't like is Marxist, and Marx is responsible for the Soviet Union. So as soon as anyone suggests that maybe it might be an idea to kind of have a bit less inequality or something, up pop Jordan Peterson and Ben Shapiro and all the others to say that that's the start of the slippery slope to the gulags. And during my kind of studies of Marx, it's very obvious that this is just a really wrong-headed way to look at Marx. So, for one thing, Marx predicted failure for revolutions in Russia. And he even wrote to Russian revolutionaries in the 1880s and told them that. He gave them a little bit of a get-out clause, which was that if other countries, more advanced countries, joined in, if the Russian Revolution sparked revolutions elsewhere, then there was a chance that a Russian revolution might be successful. But on the whole, he thought that a revolution must come from the most advanced capitalist countries. And the reason for that is really that socialism requires a certain amount of material wealth. Right. If you try to kind of equalize everything when you just don't have enough stuff, all you do is share out shortfall, and that annoys everyone, and that's not sustainable. So his phrase was, all the old filthy business would be restored. So he's very clear. His whole theory of history revolves around the idea that you need to have capitalism first, and you need to have quite advanced capitalism. Capitalism is really good at producing the technological advances, huge leaps in productive capacity to provide the material abundance that makes socialism viable.
It's so interesting. I interviewed somebody a few months ago, and I said that. I remember her face turning, and I said, no, I mean, my interpretation, and I hope I wasn't reinventing history, was exactly what you just said. But why do you think that part of the narrative gets completely eliminated from the conversation, and much of it about ending capitalism or challenging capitalism, depending on what you want to, how you want to interpret it?
Well, I think some of it is left out because the people who control the media and everything don't want that in the narrative. Yeah. But also, I think we on the left as well have to kind of take some blame, because we often look at Marx through the prism of Lenin and Trotsky. Right. And that's their view. They both knew, and they both said in the early days of the revolution that there was no way they could survive, that the regime could survive without sparking revolutions elsewhere. And they put a lot of effort into trying to spark those revolutions. But when they didn't happen, then the Soviet Union took a different course. But I think theoretically, people tend to look more at what Lenin and Trotsky did right, what Stalin probably did wrong, is most people's take on things. And we tend to judge the Soviet Union in terms of how socialist it was, whether it ever achieved socialism, how close they came, whether they were on the right track. And actually, really, that's diverting us away from looking at the way that Marx may have looked at it. It's understandable because they claimed to be a socialist country, and I think they were genuinely trying to be a socialist country, but they very rarely had the chance to actually implement socialist policies. Most of the time, they were reacting to hostilities from outside and internal pressures as well. And Lenin said a few times that just everyone knows socialism is impossible. The immediate introduction of socialism in Russia is impossible. But those circumstances never got any better, and socialism was never really a viable option in the Soviet Union, particularly if you look at that from Marx's point of view.
And he focused so much on cities for this reason in particular, right? I mean, even though it was organizing in cities, organizing in urban communities where there was some sort of production.
That's true. And the problem, part of the problem really, is that in Russia in 1917, about 75% of the population were working in agriculture, which means, and that's equivalent to the position England was in about 1600. So when you've got 75% of people working in agriculture, they're each producing enough food for themselves and a third of another person. And that's just not enough to sustain towns and urban growth and the industrialization that comes along with that. You need to have a kind of a revolution in agriculture and in agricultural production before you can before you can build on that and kind of develop an industrial proletariat. And
no, go ahead. No, go ahead.
Okay, so one of the things that I look at in the book, really, once we can get out of so firstly, we need to get out of the way this idea that Marx is somehow to blame for the Soviet Union, and recognize that he said that this revolution in Russia is unlikely to work. Then we can kind of take a step back and we can look at what Marx's theory of history says how we would look at it if it was any other country. And when we look at Russia in 1917, it was very similar in many ways to England in 1600. And so in a book, I go through the process that Marx describes. He spends a lot of time describing the emergence of capitalism in England. And he lists a set of criteria which were not in place in 1600 and which had to come into place before capitalism could emerge. And actually, when you then look at the Soviet Union, you see exactly those criteria being met. Some of them before the revolution, from the 1860s, there was the emancipation of the serfs. But then really nothing very much changed until 1917. And various processes that happened in the Soviet Union, such as the collectivization of agriculture, that's almost the same as a process of eviction and enclosure going on in England. It took a much longer time in England, and they had to keep waiting for new technology to be invented. So it's kind of really condensed in the Soviet Union. But if you can try and get out of your head the whole thing about trying to create socialism and whether or not they failed at that, and look at the things that the policies that they did and the changes that those policies made compared from 1917 until 1990, what they did was they put in place the missing pieces that, according to Marx, capitalism needs before it can develop. And then when the Soviet Union collapsed due to pressures from inside and outside and the weight of its own kind of inefficiency and bureaucracy, then the Russian oligarchs swept in, and that was the start really of Russian capitalism in 1990. So you can see the Soviet period and the immediately preceding period almost as Russia's transition from feudalism to capitalism.
Interesting. Did he ever write about the fear of a bureaucracy? I mean, obviously the failures of the USSR, so much of it being bureaucracy and political, however you want to say it, like the insider politics, the way that every sort of political infrastructure corrupts itself.
There was a lot, and around kind of the Paris Commune and various events around there were lots of kind of infighting, I guess. So not necessarily infighting, but discussions and debates about the best way to proceed. And it's surprising, actually, most people who haven't read any Marx are quite surprised to realise that he didn't really write very much about what socialism or communism would look like. That's not to say he didn't say anything about it, but there's no kind of detailed blueprint there. There's a kind of a 10-point plan early on in his life, but as he got older, he was much more kind of open about exactly how these things might be achieved. And I think it's naive to imagine that you're going to everyone's going to swan off into a socialist sunrise without any debates over how exactly that should be organised. But I don't think really kind of preempting that was a thing that occupied Marx very much.
Thanks for watching and listening to The Nomiki Show. But remember to click like and subscribe on YouTube, and please share on social media. If you're not already a patron, please join us for as low as $5 a month on patreon.com/The Nomiki Show for early and special content. That investment makes a huge difference. We are not corporate media raking in the dough. It's really you guys that are keeping us going. So please consider being a patron. And to our current patrons, thank you so much. We are incredibly grateful to you. We also now have swag. So check us out on thenomikishow.com to get your mugs, your totes, and your stickers.